asked for some questions. I don't see a lot in there, but I'm going to loop us back to the first conversation. And in that, Dr. Teresa Tam, the Chief Public Health Officer, and Dr. Stephen Hoffman talked about a global research agenda, is what he talked about, that had equity as a focus. And she talked about taking an equity approach to the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that she said, and I've heard her say a number of times since then, is that no one is protected until everyone is protected. And the range of solutions and ideas that the three of you have provided today is, I think, very comprehensive. And I was in another meeting this morning, and one of the things they talked about was a convergence of intent and convergence of commitment. And I hear that too in what the three of you have said. So I wonder about just if we could have some final comments. There's people are putting some things into the chat box, more comments and ideas than questions. But I wonder if the three of you could speak to that notion of convergence of intent, convergence of commitment. You used the word solidarity, Sume. And in terms of action, like what are some concrete actions that we collectively could take on the way forward? We're at 47. We got about 10 or 12 minutes left here. So Arne, I'm going to come back to you.
Sure.
But just sort of thinking, we asked that, what's the question that remains unanswered? But in terms of that convergence of intent and commitment, what are some of your final thoughts around that from an action perspective?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the question of, looking at it through a whole of government approach, that, if you have certain developments in one area within your social system, they will impact other areas. And so if you just, within the health system, try to focus to be more equitable, it's not going to work. We really need to question our larger neoliberal structures in society that have been dominant for so long. And that includes what Louise mentioned, questioning scarcity. There's no such thing as scarcity. Scarcity is a neoliberal concept that was designed in such a way to justify austerity. Of course, governments have infinite resources because they can tax. And so taxation, by definition, the fact that the state can tax by definition means that there's no limit to the taxation power of the state.
Just to be respectful to our French-speaking participants, if you could just go a little slower. I'm sorry.
I'll try.
Yeah, I know you're just a little slower, they can at least catch the gist.
So acknowledging that these questions are all related. So, if we want to achieve health equity, we have to talk to our finance minister. We can't do it without talking to the finance minister and acknowledging that within the realm of finance, something has to change dramatically. And, to some extent, governments have acknowledged that. Even like Joe Biden now is arm twisting Trudeau into raising corporate taxes. So Biden has on its agenda now a global harmonized tax rate, corporate tax rate, so that we at least have a minimum standard, which could raise trillions of dollars globally. And that would have a transformative impact on our ability to actually invest in all of the things that we need to invest in. And so acknowledging the interrelationship of all these different spheres is really an important starting point. And so in terms of concrete actions, my point would be that the actions that we take within the health system have to be related to the actions that we take outside if we want to move in some kind of transformative, progressive direction. We can't just focus it, narrow in on the health system. And we need better data in the health system. We need better processes of case tracing. For example, we had very little guidance on health equity and case tracing. The US actually developed a workbook for health equity and case tracing. So they applied health equity considerations to case tracing early on, which we didn't do in Canada. These are all important things to do. But at the same time, we need to move outside of the health system and then address the larger question of neoliberal dominance, scarcity. How can we get those that control the levers of power in this country on board for these types of transformative agenda that we really need to be pushing for? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Arne. And I'm going to ask Claire O'Gorman just to open her mic. And I saw a couple of questions coming in while you were speaking there, Arne. So Claire, do you want to just frame, and we'll get Sume and then Louis to answer those questions. I like Mariette Chartiers' one in that she turns it a little bit to the positive. So go ahead, Claire.
And thanks everyone for your amazing questions here. There's so much conversation to be had. Some great questions about, especially, you know, from folks within the system, if you will, how to work as advocates and work to change some of these power imbalances. And I've dropped a few resources that I hope will be some good starting points for a bit of that learning. And I also think there's some opportunity, as Donna said here, for us to connect with one another, to work on how we can do this collaboratively and learn from one another as well. Mariette's question here is again to that positive, and I think a nice way to end our conversation today and end our conversation series, which is, what has Canada done right to decrease inequities during this pandemic, if any? And welcome your thoughts on that.
And I think just to give Arne a chance, I think in your first opening comments, you talked about CERB as being one of the most positive social policy innovations, if you will.
We've done a lot right, I would say. And the report kind of details a lot of what we have done right. Because, you know, I mean, Trudeau really stepped up to the plate in the sense that he made more investments than any other OECD country in social terms of health. So it's very clear that Canada has invested most in social terms of health pathways, more than any other country in the OECD world, in response to the pandemic. And so, you know, we have to acknowledge that. The big question in my mind, and there's still groups of people that were left out. You know, people with disabilities in Canada, they're really left out. They got a one-off payment, I think it was $200. And then, you know, they were sent, okay, that's it, and nothing else. And so there's certain groups, Indigenous communities, we talked about that, how they were not left out, but they didn't receive the fair share, in my opinion, anyways. And so there were problems with how the money was being distributed, for sure. But at the end of the day, there were massive investments, larger investments than anywhere else in the world. And so I think we should acknowledge that the question now is going to be, are these just going to be phased out? Are we going to see a return to the previous model? Or can we maintain momentum towards emphasizing that we need to reform the system? And there was some acknowledgement early on that we need to reform the system. So we can't just now phase it out slowly, and then go back to normal, pretending that nothing happened. That is not a good solution. And so we need to keep the pressure on to make some of these changes permanent. For example, EI, to make it much easier to qualify for employment insurance, to make that permanent.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Arne. Sume, I'm going to go to you. And then Louis, I'm going to give you the last word in terms of what has Canada done right in terms of our response collectively to COVID-19. Sume?
You know, I would agree with Arne. I think the income supports have been our most significant investments in just in terms of even on a global scale. And again, just reemphasizing that even with those things, there were some people who still left out, both for CERB and also for the support to businesses, as an example. So I think even as we roll, I think it's important for us to keep those two things in mind, both the social determinant of how we're trying to address and the equity dimensions of that, because we can make this very significant investments, which I would agree are very positive. And so, again, just echoing what Arne was saying, like, I think the question of, are those going to be permanent or are they going to be rolled back? And we're already seeing some of those things being rolled back. So I want to pick up on a comment which is coming in, which I think we see quite often, which is that for most of us who work in public health, we are working as part of, like, we are the government, right? We're working as part of the public service. And so how do we continue to play an advocacy role? And so it speaks to my earlier comment. I think as a field, as a system, we actually need to invest in public policy advocacy as part of it. So it's no longer something which we do from the side of our desk where we get penalized for doing it in different ways, but it moves beyond being a simple competence to, within our organizations, we actually have people who, that is part of your role, is to bring forth this. And when we have the opportunities to do so, we do so in very clear ways, unapologetically. We don't act like we do not know why we're seeing this. We're saying we know why we're seeing this, and here's what we can do about it. So to me, coming back to how we invest in the public health system itself, so it's no longer just an individual responsibility. Another positive example, which is not necessarily the Canadian government, but in terms of, as a civil society response, is that we did see a lot of public health associations, organizations, and broader community-based organizations actively engage in the policy and advocacy process in different ways. So one example, which It's not COVID-19 specific, but as an example, the Canadian Public Health Association has been an intervener in the recent Supreme Court case on greenhouse pollution pricing, which we know has, I mentioned the importance of addressing climate change earlier. So this is a public health organization saying we are going to be part of this process, which is making its way all the way to Supreme Court. So our public health associations can sometimes provide us with a bit more flexibility than we can do in our paid jobs. So I'd say that's something which we should all be taking advantage of where possible. And also that this is, it's long-term work. I remember something, Louis, you said around this time last year, right? You said power asserts it, seeks to reassert itself. So we can't, I think if we let go, we will return to a lot of what we had before. So if we do not want to see that, we have to get organized. In some of the previous conversations, some of the speakers spoke to the importance of political action. So really bringing that forth in terms of what we do as a field, I think is critically important.
Thanks, Sume, and thanks for bringing us back to those words from that original or first series, and that back to better. It was actually said by a participant in that series prior to any of the other things that have been said about back to better along the way. So, and power reasserting itself, I think we need to expect that, anticipate it, and really lean into that. So thanks for that, and for your words around advocacy as not just a core competence, but actually as a core function of what public health does and can do in this country. Thank you for that. So Louis, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to turn the mic over to you to maybe some final comments and then a closing. But meanwhile, I'd like to ask all of you that are still with us to put your one word in the chat box for this particular conversation series. So what's that one word that's percolating or bubbling up to your mind right now as we close out? So Louis, over to you.
Thank you. In a quick 2 minutes, some of what I've heard so far that really resonates is how we need to move from scarcity to generosity. And do we have a deep structural understanding of that? Because if you're going to do some equity-based, equity-centered initiatives, which is about redistributing and recalibrating the sharing of power and resources, we have to have the mindset of generosity. And it's not because one is benevolent and the other one it has the merits of receiving. It's about equality and stuff. There is a 20-year gap, as you know, in the lifespan of many marginalized communities, be it mental health, be it Indigenous people, and most disabled people. So the marginalized people die younger, and the crisis reveals those vulnerabilities, but we often miss opportunities to speak to them when we make equity-focused decisions as to what was the logic, what was the moral, what was the duty to do that. We almost treat it as if it's a treaty status payment, where here's your $5, but let's not talk about the underpinnings of what brought us here and where we're going from here. So we should be grateful when someone takes those are good measures, but they're also very important to have conversations to educate people on that. And we're not doing a great job about that in a sense. And so one of the nice things that I saw this year in Manitoba is that when you share power and you share decision making with Indigenous people, some pretty important things can happen that are of influence. And one small example is when Marcia Anderson, who is a medical officer of health here in Manitoba, worked at the senior leadership level with the province and demanded that Indigenous peoples in Manitoba receive their vaccine much sooner in age than the average population, in a sense. So 20 years younger so individuals. It was an opportunity to acknowledge that we died 20 years younger, but it was also giving hope. And the other thing that she claimed publicly about that decision, the importance of that decision, and was reiterated to me by some of the elders in our community. And they came together and they said to me, they gave us this vaccine because Marcia showed them that we value our knowledge keepers. We value those who are keepers of our culture and the knowledges, both scientific in all domains. And so it was important to have them vaccinated to protect them. I was sad when I heard that, because I thought, if it wasn't for those individuals, where would our knowledges be kept? And we as public health leadership and organization are knowledge keepers. And so the equity work is about keeping the knowledge alive in a way and validating those worldviews, all dimensions of those worldviews as they pertain to public health. And they were honored that they were seen as valuable. Now, I don't know about the broad society, how we felt about our elders in this regard, if we viewed them that way, or did we only see them as vulnerable peoples? And Indigenous people don't want to be seen as vulnerable people. They have valid arguments and perspectives and contributions to make. And so one of the things I learned more recently is from someone working in public health who shared to me, I feel, she said, that I am running in circles in public health. I have always felt that way, and I keep running in circles and circles, and even through the pandemic, and she feels moving forward, she's going to run in circles. It's really hard. And I said, that's probably because you are running in a box. And that's what structure is. And so they create a box and they ask us to run in circles within that box. And so we have to look at the boxes that have been created if we're going to look at solutions. The solutions in public health, and that we always said that in health, is that the solutions to social issues, ecological issues, racial issues, all these solutions might not come from within healthcare. And public health is part of that system because it has a tendency to preserve itself. So let's move beyond being enablers to becoming allies, because enablers support the status quo, and allies walk in arm in arm with those who have the right to these things, to justice, to have the right to health, to have a right to equal status and stuff. So we cannot just be silent on inequity. We have to really be vigilant in that regard. So it's in the data, because one point of data might have more worth than the whole spectrum of data that we collect, if it tells the right story that has not been heard. And so that's how we have to look at data, is look at where are the equity points in this data, where are the voices. So with that, I say thank you.
Thank you, Louis, and thanks for those lovely closing words, and for really that call to action in solidarity. So thank you very much. Thank you, Arne, for being with us today. Thank you, Sume, for always your energizing and provocative words, and thank you, Louis. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and this concludes our series. Make sure you put that one word in there, and stay tuned, visit our website. There's lots of really good material there, and don't be afraid to reach out to us with comments, questions, anything that we can do to support you in the important work that you do every day. Thank you, and bye for now.